So let's take a look at this little argument. Tax policy is generally not well understood by most Americans. The reasons for this are not simple. On the one hand, people have a direct interest in how they are taxed, but at the same time tend to shy away from discussions of finance and economics. In addition, few ever take any formal classes at the high school or college level that lay out the basics of tax policy. This ignorance is unfortunate, since in a democracy it would be good if all citizens had some grasp of the way that they are taxed and their government services are financed. Okay, so we obviously have something argumentative here. We know it's an argument. As is often the case with real-world arguments or so-called arguments in the wild, it's not always clear what the main point is. It may have more than one main point. But let's look at what the candidates are for the overall conclusion of the argument. It may be this, right? This first statement here, that tax policy is generally not well understood by most Americans. It's a little ambiguous here when they say the reasons for this are not simple. It can be a very fine line between arguing for something and explaining something. The reasons that are given here that where basically that people tend to shy away from discussions of finance and economics, and also that few take any actual formal classes that lay out the basics of tax policy. Do they justify the statement that tax policy is generally not well understood by most Americans, or do they explain it? I would say that they explain it. They give reasons for it. They give the causes of it. Put in another way, perhaps they could be more directly justifications. People have, if you say that, people shy away from discussions of finance and economics, or they don't take classes that explain things like tax policy, we could maybe cast it as more of a justification of the statement, but it's really more of an explanation, giving the causes of the ignorance of tax policy by, seemingly by most Americans, or that's what the claim is. And then we have a sentence here at the end: this ignorance is unfortunate, since, and that of course is a premise indicator, in a democracy it would be good if all citizens had some grasp of the way that they are taxed and their government services are financed. So if we had to say what the overall conclusion here was, what the main point of the argument was, I would say that it's right here. Okay. And this ignorance, of course, referring back to this claim here. Here it's put as ignorance. Here it's put as not being well understood, but generally the same basic point that people don't understand the tax policy of their own government is being claimed. And I guess, really, I would have to say that the overall conclusion is here. And that if we were to lay this argument out, we would say, tax policy is not well understood by most Americans. And then maybe, include the causes that the author is giving of that lack of understanding. But to say basically that this is the case, that most Americans don't understand the tax system. And then to say, in a democracy, it would be good if all citizens had some grasp of the way that they are taxed and their government services are financed. And then that leading to the conclusion that this ignorance is unfortunate. Now, oftentimes, when it comes down to paraphrasing arguments or laying out their logical structure, we do change the wording. We keep the sense, but we change the wording to make things more explicit or simplify things. So I think if we were to say what the overall conclusion is to this argument, we would say, put it as something like this. But that would probably, I think, be the best candidate as being the overall conclusion. And the main reason giving for that is that in democracy, it would be good if citizens had some grasp of the way that they are taxed and their government services are financed, as being perhaps the most important reason given in support of that statement. So we're to lay it out in standard form, at least partially. We would put a horizontal line here indicating the therefore or the so or whatever, that what follows is the conclusion. And we would put this here as the main reason. And we could even put this up here as a separate premise. We might decide that this premise is actually an intermediate conclusion because some reasons are given for it. But it's not sure that they're reasons rather than referring to causes. So we could even leave that out, maybe keeping it in mind as we analyze or as we begin to evaluate the argument. So we more or less, through this discussion, have made our decisions about the logical structure of the argument, what its main conclusion is, how that conclusion purports to be supported by the premises and such. And now it's time to make some decisions about whether it's a sound argument, whether it's a good argument, whether its conclusion is well supported by its premises.